Well, I'm going to try to make the last 3 hours relevant. My talk is on the health effects of regulatory costs, and I want to make the case that the health effects, there are important health effects from the regulatory costs, and I will go through something that we all did at OMB a while back that became fairly notorious. Now, I'm retired. I retired from government in 2008. I worked about 35 years in the Executive Office of the President and OMB, and have not directly worked since then on ozone. I did work on Tier 3 for Bloomberg, but I think it was a different Bloomberg. It was Mike Bloomberg's. There any relation between? Okay. And it was a analytical piece for a news magazine, a news. It's like they bought BNA, Bureau of National Affairs. Now, oh, this is the green one. Up here? Nope.
Controller, you got to find it. Controller.
It's over here.
Oh.
No, I mean, you're.
Oh, you point over. I point at you?
Those laptops.
Oh, okay. There I did. All right. Now, I used to be a professor of economics long time ago now at a rival school of the University of Texas, at least in football. Killed you in basketball. But the first thing we teach in the principle of economics is that the most important principle is that we inevitably face a trade-off between that everything has a trade-off, and opportunity costs in particular are determined by the value of the second best choice. But according to the Clean Air Act, and this is directly from the RIA, that's about all I've read, the RIA, but it was 550 pages. According to the Clean Air Act, the Environmental Protection Agency must use health-based criteria in setting the NACs and cannot consider estimates of compliance costs. So we have right off at the beginning here a major difference between how an economist would look at this and how the EPA is required to look at this. But this is actually more important. We've all talked about this. We know it's been mentioned. But I was thinking about it, and you probably know that the administrator is not even allowed to read the RIA. And that was true in the Bush 43 administration as well as the Obama administration. That's how it's been interpreted. She cannot even look at it. So what do you think that means to the quality of the cost analysis in particular? It means that EPA is not going to put as much time and effort into it, and they may keep recycling their old approaches to it and some of the models they've used. Thus, I think the $15,000 assumption of unknown cost per ton is a violation of economics and probably would not be done if it was going to be subject to a judicial interpretation or a judicial review. So let's go to 2. So as you probably know, economists really prefer to look at the benefit cost analysis, and that's in fact what the OMB has done under executive order. So with cost benefit analysis prohibited, we are left with just benefits analysis, and in particular health-based criteria, as the RIA states. But the key insight is, this hasn't really been talked about too much, is that opportunity costs includes a subset of health benefits. A certain percentage of one's marginal income, as it is increased, is spent on safety and health, enhancing goods and services. And that actually probably is a pretty high percentage. So this is a true opportunity cost. It's a fundamental finding that we need to examine. So I'm going to talk about what's called health analysis, and the reason I'm talking about it is because we developed it at OMB and at least gave the terminology health analysis in a 1992 case. Back then we had I was in charge of OSHA. I wasn't looking at EPA, and we had a case where they were issuing a regulation with mostly based on animal studies for carcinogens for 600 workplace air contaminants. And OSHA's position at that time was that under the Supreme Court ruling in Cotton Dust, which I had worked on in the Carter administration, you weren't allowed to use a benefit cost analysis to set health standards. And so I thought about it and looked about it, read the literature, and determined that we needed to use a health analysis, and we invented this terminology. Now, this is different. Health analysis is different from risk analysis, which you probably know about. In fact, risk analysis has been used in ozone because there are offsetting risks, as we've talked about. Tropospheric ozone, perhaps, and some people in inner counties that may actually benefit because of the chemistry of ozone and the weather patterns. So there's a risk going on there. But this is different. This is a broad kind of analysis. It's health, and that's what we developed the term. And this whole idea was developed outside of economists. Economists don't like this. Paul Portney is going to get up and tell me, because he actually wrote an article about this when we did it, that we should be using benefit cost analysis, not health analysis. But when you can't use benefit cost analysis, maybe we have to use the second best approach. But anyway, just in case you don't know a little bit about the history, but this goes back to Aaron Wildowski, who passed away, who was probably one of the best political scientists, most well-known, searching for safety, I think it was in 1988. Ralph Keeney, who's one of the top decision scientists in the country and developed this key method, the key analysis, and then it was used by Judge Stephen Williams in the U.S. Court of Appeals in 1991, which is pretty key, which is actually where we got the idea of using it in our interventions at OMB, where we were prohibited from using benefit cost analysis, but still we're acting in the president's interest and the national interest to try to make regulations more cost effective. So in terms of health analysis and NACs, there was already, Dr. McClellan already, I think, had this in his article. I wasn't here yesterday, but he may have mentioned it. The Supreme Court Justice Stephen Breyer, who actually is one of the best Supreme Court justices, obviously, on economics, because he's written several books on risk analysis and risk regulation, and he's quite astute there. Here's a quote from him. "The statute also permits the administrator to take account of comparative health risks. That is to say, she may consider whether the proposed rule promotes safety overall. A rule likely to cause more harm to health than it prevents is not a rule that is requisite to protect the public health," which is the language of the Act. So that's the case, and we tried to implement this, as I said, in 1992, and a colleague of mine, Randy Lutter, and I wrote an article that laid this all out. It was called Health Analysis, a New Way to Regulate Health and Safety Regulation. And then we followed it up a few years later with Kip Viscusi, who's one of the top economists in the country in terms of citations, like number 5 or something, and especially in the area of evaluating health benefits, and he's well cited and well used by EPA. And I'll talk about those in a minute. But it's also been used, health analysis, by HHS, of course by OMB. We put it in some of our budget reports. It was used by OSHA. It's also been used in another couple of countries, and this is just a quick search. It's also been used or talked about by the Institute of Medicine study, which was a key study that was done and published in 2006 called Valuing Health for Regulatory Cost Effectiveness Analysis, where it looked at using quality adjusted life years for regulatory intervention. That's the well-known technique, CEA, been used, as you probably know, in public health and medicine to rank various methods of achieving a particular outcome, which is better help. Now, Cass Sunstein has written in this area, and you probably know Cass. He sent, in 2011, he sent back the ozone reconsideration to EPA, and it was to quite fanfare. And he has written quite a bit of articles and books on health analysis, and he treated it quite favorably. So that's a good sign. Of course, he's gone now, so we no longer have a reconsideration, we have a proposal. And Frank Cross, he's actually on the law faculty here at the University of Texas and I just looked him up, in the law school, and he wrote a very excellent book. A very excellent article in the Ecology Law Quarterly in 1995, where he gave a very good analysis of all the various issues connected to using this techniques. And here's a quote. While the claims for health analysis, like any position, may be exaggerated, I find that the theory is fundamentally sound and that costly public health regulations may indeed cause more health harm than good. So that's a lawyer, so he must be right. I don't really know Frank Cross. I should probably look him up since I guess he's probably still here. So the whole key up to this is the well-known wealth health or income health gradient. So this goes back, gets a little bit of history, you know, we're economists. The economic deprivation is strongly related to ill health, that was first discovered scientifically and documented way back by a Frenchman, of all things, in 1820. Well, they also looked at cost-benefit analysis back then. I mean, one of the first people. And then again in 1840, the 1840 study is quite well known. It was civil servants, and they've continued it since in Great Britain. It was of civil servants' income and mortality, and they found a very strong relationship with civil servants. So it's very interesting. This relationship is well known in sociology, demography, public health, epidemiology, and development economics. And all these literatures don't refer to each other. They're all going at it their separate way and making this different conclusions. But the most interesting thing I found in doing this background research back then was that this argument has been used very strongly by the same people that are critical now in the 80s to argue for progressive taxation and transfers and aggressive economic stabilization programs. But when we introduced this in 1992, it made headlines in the Washington Post, New York Times, every place. And for the first time that I know of, and I'm not even sure it's happened since, several of us, 3 of us who worked on this, developed this, including my boss, who were civil servants, were called up to the Hill, and we were from the White House. This is the first time that had really been done. Not political people, and interrogated within 3 days of the time we sent this letter to OSHA asking them to do this new kind of analysis because they couldn't do benefit cost analysis on a regulation that they were issuing, which was quite costly. So these are some of the quotes, and these are, I don't know if I should mention the people that said this, but anyway, because they're well known. Inmates are running the asylum. Absolutely loony, the most crazy logic to date. And this is actually, some of these terms were done in mentioned in Frank Cross's article. So the absolute loony, the most crazy logic to date, was the person that called us up before his Senate Government Affairs Committee, and he was one of my heroes, but I never gotten to talk to like that, not even from my father, who was actually a real doctor. He was an MD, and that, of course, was Senator Glenn. Suddenly, it was really, we were really raked over the coals. It was something that still sticks in my mind, obviously, after all these years. But we pressed on, and Bush 41, the administration, even though they didn't know what we were doing, to tell you the truth, even though we weren't, they thought it was a big political conspiracy. That was the other theory. It was a bunch of civil servants trying to do the right thing and given some discretion. So they set GAO on top to do a critique of us, which they did in 1 month, and of course they came out critical, but they got everything wrong. So here's another quote from Professor Cross. Controversy arises when the results are used in health analysis to argue against promulgation of a public health regulation. There was no real controversy before then. So here are some of the conclusions that some pretty well-known people have mentioned. So Frank Cross, a lawyer looking at things, I think objectively had no axe to grind here. In sum, the correlation between income and health is well supported by a broad range of studies that all reach the same conclusion. These data are far more conclusive than the data used to justify regulation of a hazardous substance or activity. In fairness, he was looking mainly at what EPA and other agencies were doing way back in the 80s and 90s. They were basing their regulations for Superfund and other things on animal studies. One type of mouse out of 3 or 4 got cancer, and so they would try to regulate it. Since then, they of course found PM, and now there are a lot of benefits and other probably good health justified reasons for some of the regulations that we have now. Back then, it was in some sense more controversial. And then Angus Deaton, I don't know, you probably don't know who he is, but he's probably the world's leading authority on income, world authority, as famous professor at Princeton. And writing in Health Affairs in an article funded by the MacArthur Foundation back then, what causes the gradient if not income? And it's clear, he said, that they are mutually determined. And so obviously, if you're healthier, you're going to have a higher income. But if you also get more income, it turns out there's a very strong evidence that you could be healthy. There's also, of course, as we all talking about causality before, could be a third factor. And I think there's a role for a third factor, which I've been thinking about, and that is I think both health and wealth are correlated with one's discount rate. Now, what that means is if you have a longer horizon, you have a lower discount rate, you want to invest in yourself, higher income, better health, there's going to be a correlation. And that seems to differ from person to person. Some people live for the day, some people live for when they can retire and leave OMB. And move to a Caribbean island and live happily ever after. And then, of course, you probably know, is the epidemiologist among you, Harvey Brunner, Johns Hopkins, pretty famous epidemiologist. The most extensive and robust findings in epidemiology, epi-patterns, is this income health gradient. So where are we going from here? Well, we need to operationalize health analysis. We need an estimate for the second H. So this is health minus health analysis. First health is the intended consequence of the regulation. The second health is the unintended consequence, or it could be the unintended consequence. There are 2 ways to estimate this, which have been called different names in the literature. One, our article, we call it willingness to spend. Another one is called, by the Swedish people, I like this one, value of induced death void. But I think the simplest is cost per life saved, the cutoff, and we will use that. And it also makes sense to just look at not health, but mortality. Because actually, for ozone, that's 98% of the benefits in their RIA, the benefits from mortality reductions, at least estimated by EPA. So the point to make is that, of course, income is also found to have strong relationships with morbidity. So if you leave it out morbidity on the direct side, we're also leaving it out on the indirect side. So just briefly before we go into how we did it, how it's been done, there's probably at least 4 linkages from income to health, with income being the causality for better health. This is protective expenditures, which I was trying to get at with the opportunity costs, which we'll talk about. Part of your spending is going to be on safety and health, and if you take away all that spending and spend it somewhere where it's not producing any benefits, it's a lost opportunity, and it means you're going to have less health and safety. Second is there's a whole literature on psychological stress. As your income goes down, and lower income people overall just have higher stress, and they can't really figure out why. They have all these bad indicators and endpoints when people have low income. They haven't been able to link it. And then there's something that we thought about and brought in an analysis I'll mention, individual behavioral changes. As we go up in income, as you probably know, you quit smoking. You perhaps do less, not drinking, but binge drinking, which is where the harm is, most of the harm. And then they're driving. You drive a safer car, you get a bigger car, you eat better diet, et cetera, and also you exercise more, at least especially Dawn, and diet. Dawn must have really high income, because you should see how much he exercises. Then finally, the social evolutionary changes. Over time, societies and individuals, groups of countries seem to be evolving towards wanting more health and safety. Why is that? We're not sure. But in the development literature, it's very clear that that's what's happened. I just got back from India, and wow. And the ozone levels then were unbelievable. But you should see the way they take chances, and it's such a poor country, and it's unbelievable, the public health. Again, it varies by the income in the city, by parts of India. So those are 4 different ways that you probably have causality. So the one way to do it is look at as a direct estimate of the income cutoff, because we're trying to find a cutoff that we can use in our analysis. And so we surveyed back in '94, Journal of Risk and Uncertainty, all the various studies that had been done up to that point that looked at this relationship. And they range from this cutoff in terms of how much income it took. And these are panel studies, these are country studies, these are county studies, these are cross-sectional studies, panel data. And I changed these to $211, which is what the RIA and EPA uses as their base year, 2011 for dollars for inflation. It ranged from about $5 million to $20 million. And the Joint Economic Committee that I sort of mentioned used this to try to argue for more stabilization programs in 1984. Is in that range. Dooley, John Graham, who also used to be the head of OIRA, as well as Cass Sunstein, used to be head of the Harvard School of Risk, and now is dean at Indiana. He did a study too. It came in around $5 million, $6 million, looking cross-sectionally, looking longitudinally in the United States. And then Keeney, one of the first key studies, was used around 12, well, now I guess it would be around 20 million. And Chapman and Harahan actually did a pretty good analysis where they tried to control for prior health states and education, all those things, very, very, very carefully instrumental variables, trying to find causality. And they again came up with a higher number, in the 20 million range. And then we tried to do, my colleague and I tried to do we did a fairly extensive international analysis using purchasing power parity, 1980 dollars, and looking at about 100 countries or so, looking at it over time and cross-sectionally and controlling for quite a few variables, and we got an estimate of about $15 million. So in other words, if, say, if society lost $15 million, it could induce one mortality. Take it out, and that's the theory that we're talking about here. All right. So there's another approach to this too. So that was a direct approach. Simply look at the epi data mainly and correlate it with income variables. All different models were used. But there's a theoretical economic model that's also, I think, pretty well accepted in economics anyway. It's a utility maximizing behavioral model. And so we think may bypass some of the reverse causality issues. So here's the equation. Cutoff equals willingness to pay. Now, who knows what willingness to pay is? Oh, no. So willingness to pay is used to try to estimate the value of a statistical life. And EPA uses 8.3 million right now. They're going to use for their benefits analysis, they use 10 million because they raised the benefits for the 2025 as income went up. So they're using a willingness to pay of $10 million. So what that means is that they've estimated these numbers. And one of the key persons here was Kip Viscusi, who's done this, and his numbers have been used by EPA for 20 years. How you estimate, there are a lot of different ways to estimate how much somebody would be willing to pay for a small reduction in risk. or how much they'd be willing to accept to take a safer job, or take a riskier job, I mean. So let's say you have 10,000 people, and you have a reduction. I gotta look up, get my numbers right, because I'm tired and nervous in this example. Yeah, let's say there are 10,000 people, and we can reduce risk by about $100. We're willing to pay $500 for a reduction of 1 in 10,000 risk per year. That translates into $5 million if you blow it up by adding 10,000 people, by multiplying it by 10,000 people. So that's what's called a willingness to pay, and it's very well accepted in economics. They have estimated this not just from labor market studies, but they've also estimated it by looking at stated preference studies, where you ask people by setting up controlled experiments how much they'd be willing to pay for this attribute, that attribute, et cetera. They've also estimated it by looking at how much people pay for safer cars, holding everything else. It's got a hedonic wage equation, it's called. And they can tease out with multiple regression analysis with all its problems, but there's a lot of techniques, how much a reduction in mortality would be, people would be willing to pay. They've done it by looking at seatbelt use. All these have ranged around a value in which EPA, as I said, currently using about 8.3 million, which I think a little high, but whatever. When we did our OMB at one time had an estimate, say 1 to 10 million would be a good range where they would all fit in. We put that out in a 2003 manual on how to do regulatory impact analyses. So the willingness to pay, that number, 5 million, 10 million, whatever, is divided by the marginal propensity to spend on health and safety enhancing products. And the idea is that we're all utility maximizers. We look across the range of expenditures and products we buy and try to equalize on the margin. And the margins seem to be fairly consistent around this $5, $10 million. So if we spend a certain percentage of our income on that, that's going to give you an estimate of the cutoff value and how much would actually be lost. So, for example, let's see. Well, Kip first did this estimate in '94. What he did, he used his estimate, of course, of a willingness to pay of $5 million. And he assumed that, I think I do actually have that slide. Oh, here it is. And he used as the denominator the percentage of one's income that is GDP is spent on health. And that was back then, in 1990, was 10%. And bring it up to today's dollars, that's $85 million. So his estimate was that 10% of people what we were spending would go into health, and then that would mean that the cutoff would be $50 million, $85 million. So in other words, if income went down $85 million today, then you would induce one death. That'd be the cutoff. But I think, and he agreed, because Randy and I we wrote a combined article, Letter Morale and Viscusi, where we figured out that there were some other things that we need to take into account. Because this estimate of the healthcare underestimates, first of all, the growing share of healthcare, which is now actually 17% of GDP. It leaves out other safety-enhancing spending and behavior that occurs with increasing income. Your diet, for example, or you want to live in a safer neighborhood. You want to buy, as I said, a safer car. There are a lot of things you would spend. But there's also another interesting result from higher income. So we computed the income elasticities of spending in certain areas. Now, you probably, again, are familiar with this study that goes back, and I'm sure it's been updated by McGinnis and Foge, is that how you pronounce it? 1993, where they looked at the major causes of death that could be explained, that they got about 50% back then. And the three top ones were the known causes of death were smoking, obviously 19%, over-drinking, and diet and inactivity. So we estimated income elasticities with a large study a large panel data. Let's see if I... and redid our estimates to take that into account and put it in the denominator. And we got up actually to about, it was about 30.33 of our spending was spent in those various activities, those various areas. So what are the conclusions from this? Well, yeah, tobacco 90%, diet 14%, alcohol 5%, and there are a bunch of other things that we didn't include that would go into that kind of equation. So what are the implications for ozone? So let me give you an example. Obviously, HHA, health analysis, introduces uncertainty now from the cost side. And it seems to me you should be able to take this into account in any legal analysis you would like to do. There's another, I guess I should just point out, it's more than just, maybe it's it might be legally permissible, but it also has a very moral sense to it. I mean, I can see why a lot of people obviously don't want to look at benefits versus costs, public health benefits versus costs, public health benefits versus somebody's profits. But when you put it in these terms, when it's health versus health, there's a moral imperative that this makes a lot of sense. We should be doing this for any kind of policy. This doesn't just apply to health. It could also apply to other areas too. If a government intervention is trying to improve a specific area, it's the main reason for the statute or the regulation, it should be actually improving that area. Forget about the cost. It should be accomplishing what it's set out to accomplish. So this analysis tries to figure out whether it is or not. So I picked out the Smith study et al. Of 2009, which we've already talked about, and looked at it. Our analysis, and I used the EPA cost estimates, although I used their sensitivity analysis of $20,000 per ton because of all the reasons that have just been mentioned, that I thought that it looked like EPA was underestimating the true cost, just compliance costs, and using the no marginal cost for increasing stringency for regulations just doesn't make sense to an economist. We always thought costs were upward sloping. But so this is in 2025, and it's non-California. And we used a $25 million cutoff, which is what our study comes to in 2011 dollars, the one we did, the one we did with Viscusi, taking into account other behavioral changes. Okay, let's see what we did. So we found a negative health impact for 60 part per billion. In other words, according to the Smith study, 900 lives would be saved in 2025. But the costs implied that there'd be 200 induced deaths because of the income lost. And let's see, the study, my study, I used $50 billion, which is the cost of the 60 part per billion standard would cost $50 billion. According to EPA, using $20,000 per ton unknown costs, and plug that into the model. So there's a net, more lives are lost than saved in that particular analysis, in that particular sensitivity analysis. You go to 65 parts per billion, you get 130 lives lost. And that cost was $19 billion. And then there's a slightly positive health impact of the 70 parts per billion. 24 lives would be saved because the direct benefits are greater than the indirect public health loss. So those are my findings. Now, this is if you believe, of course, in the Smith study, 2009. So you can quarrel with that. But what's even probably more important to look at, as was just mentioned, are the distributional impacts. I mean, not more important, but very important also. The distributional impacts. Now, I'm talking about income groups, income classes. So obviously, given this relationship that everybody has knows about and is estimated, it's log linear, or it's even more exponential than that. So that means that lower income people are going to have greater impacts from a loss of income. Depends upon how the costs are distributed. And so it'll clearly affect the cutoff values. And Keeney in 1960, I think it was actually 1997, was finally published in Journal of Risk and Uncertainty. He estimated that that's very distracting, because I hear climate change actually causes premature death because of ozone, according to the Washington Post, or I guess according to the president. So Keeney did his study. He looked at spreading the costs evenly across income groups, or using it, spreading across proportionally. And his study found that the costs fell, the cutoff point fell from $20 million to $8 million in 2011. That's a huge drop-off. It's probably somewhere in between, if you want to take into account distributional impacts and the fact that lower income individuals are likely to bear a greater percentage of the costs relative to their income. In other words, they're aggressive. And since we have near here, I remember the first time the first study I saw that talked about regressivity in environmental regulation was Dave Harrison's study. I guess he's at NERA, right? On water regulation. I used to know him. So, now EPA is required by the Environmental Justice Environmental Justice Executive Order 12898, but to look at this area in broad sense. But it only looks at geographic proximity of the pollutant and maybe the fairness of the process of establishing the requirement. That's in the RIA. That's as an appendix. But as we all know, cost is likely to be disproportionately borne by lower incomes. And especially as the standard is tightened and electricity costs increase. At least I didn't have any of the analysis that Ann had before. But it's interesting, on the benefit side, that may also be regressive. Because first they don't look at valuation of the beneficial health to the individual, and that varies with income. EPA points that out, because they have income, they have the willingness to pay going up over time with income. But they've made a conscious political decision not to look at it cross-sectionally, which in a sense I agree with strategically. But even more interesting on the benefit side, and this is in their table, that as you tighten the standard, it benefits proportionally more high-income people than low-income people. Because low-income people live in areas that are less, that are more likely to be in the lower ozone areas. So it's both it looks like it may be regressive both on the benefit side and on the cost side. So, my conclusion. I'm glad I'm not at OMB anymore. And the reason I left OMB, by the way, and when I turned exactly 65 years old, was because I had stomach aches thinking about all this stuff every day. They went away right away when I left, when I retired. I'm sure others of you who retired have had that same kind of experience. So, any questions? Is it a switch?
Lawless and API. Does this merge into what I call disbenefits? In other words, you've got the solar UVB disbenefit and you've got the urban NOx disbenefit, which with reductions of NO2 or reductions in ozone particles, you have more of a health effect from these sort of indirect effects of the regulation. Does that somehow fit in?
No, not in this particular analysis. I've just looked at these two types of overall effects. Those should be taken into account too.
Thanks, that was really useful. What about loss of income resulting in more immediate or sudden, heart attack, suicide, that sort of thing? I mean, is that factored into what you're?
Well,
'cause-
I used that one epidemiological study by Smith et al., and that's short-term, that was a short-term exposure study. Yeah, all those things should, are you talking about on the ozone side or on the
Well,
longevity
just
side?
generally loss.
Oh, generally, that
just
takes-
the general observation
I
that's
don't take-
reported in, scholarly articles like USA Today, where, with the, it's just widely reported that when, with loss of income, you see
Oh.
a generalized
Well, there's-
increase in certain
There's two kinds
bad
of
outcomes.
effects. I mean, there's transitory, if you lose
Yeah.
your job, there's job effects.
Right.
And then there's the actual real long-term effects. And they go back, if a woman is a low income and she gives childbirth, obviously it's clear that there's going to be health problems 7, 10, 20 years in the future. That's all factored in the long run time series studies. I mean, that will show up.
In the long run, I guess I was looking at the more
Well,
immediate.
see, these studies are done in all different
Yeah.
kinds of ways. Panel studies, National Institute of Health Surveys does a study with all kinds of characteristics of individuals and looks at that, looks at their mortality rates. Oh, sorry. I mean, Canada has done very good studies in this area, and they all come into this range of showing effects of causality, as far as we can tell, between 5 million and 25 million or so.
Okay.
And they're all different methodologies. Again, it's not that, as was pointed out before, economists tend to use all different kinds of approaches and test different hypotheses, and so do a lot of epidemiologists. And all these are fairly conclusive. Shows a fairly broad range, but not that huge. And by the way, there's some recent studies that look at county data and see how that's affected. And there's some recent studies that look at how this has changed over time and find that it has not declined, as you might expect. There's still this strong mortality effect of higher income. And this is log linear generally, percentage change in income to the mortality rate.
And then your one key slide where you had the
I only
three
had one key slide?
with the conclusions.
Yeah.
And with the, was that based on EPA's
Yes.
costs, not
Those are
not
EPA
not Ann's or Scott's?
Those are EPA's costs. I actually,
So if Ann or Scott were
Well-
were applied to your analysis, those numbers would
I
change.
actually, when I heard the numbers, if you use the 155 billion that was used for 2025, which is the year I was using too. I wasn't using the present value the way Ann did, annualized. So I figured there would be 6,200 induced deaths from 155 billion, if that were correct. I think someone's going to, I personally think with that number that they're not going to let that happen, but that's probably why they won't let it happen, because it's going to be, you won't be able to implement it, but anyway. No, the 155 billion, I believe, was national. Texas was 40 or 50, was it? 30, yeah, 30. So the numbers change drastically if you use higher cost estimates. You use a general equilibrium model, which of course you should be using, because actually, general equilibrium models, I think this is correct, usually find higher estimates of costs than the just strict compliance costs, because of the induced effects over time and the inefficiency losses.
Right. I just wanted to clarify that the
Yeah.
numbers on the slide were
Those are
were
EPA numbers.
geared to the.
They do a sensitivity analysis of $10,000, $15,000, and $20,000 per unknown ton, and so I used the 20,000 rather than the 15. It wouldn't change things too much. And then I used just the Smith study for 2009, which is a little bit lower than the other one that they use. And I also don't include the.
We got several questions here.
With that 6,000 whatever deaths you came up with, as well as the one that you showed on the slide, is that assuming proportional distribution of the income or equal distribution of the, sorry, not of the income, of the costs?
Proportional.
So it would
There's
be
no
even
regressivity.
worse.
There's no
it-
regressivity built into those estimates.
So it would be even worse if you had done
Right.
something taking into account that it might be evenly distributed costs.
Right, right.
Thank you.
I think, Mike, did you have a question?
So Mike Dorson, Toxicology Excellence for Risk Assessment. Dr. Morale, that's a fascinating talk. I don't get into this area much at all, so I really appreciate it. The question I had is the biological discussions and epidemiological discussions, or risk assessment of the last day and a half, focus more on the idea of mortality not being as credible, perhaps, maybe I'm overstating it, as the morbidities, the respiratory effects.
Right.
So I appreciate your mortality to mortality comparison, and I think I understand why you did that, because you have mortality on both sides of the thing. It was easy to do. But I don't think most of the biologists are expecting mortality in the 60 or 65 part per billion range. So can you take the information that you've done and do the analysis on morbidities? Is that?
Yes, there's a whole literature also on the gradient between income and morbidity. You clearly, I mean, you should do both, but if there's no mortality, then you could just do it on morbidity.
Okay, so then we could.
But let me tell you what drives Washington.
Oh, okay.
Is mortality. Well,
Okay.
I mean, politically.
Okay, thank you.
But I'm just,
I think.
I'm talking about the political decisions.
Hi, Roger McClellan. I enjoyed the talk very much, John. But I wanted to, before we left, I wanted to kind of join this back to the analysis, very sophisticated analysis that Ann Smith had done, and ask this question and then make a comment. A linchpin in terms of your analysis is the use of NO2 as the primary driver in terms of reducing ozone and meeting the standard. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yes, but we did use VOCs where EPA had said VOCs would be the right.
Right. Well, again, I think that as we drive down towards lower and lower, trying to achieve lower and lower ozone, it's interesting to recall the shape of those curves, and I don't know if others of you noticed how slow the decline in ozone has been. Now, those are very difficult to interpret because they're kind of national sorts of aggregate figures. But if you struggle in terms of looking at local areas, you see the same kinds of effects. I raised the question again in terms of the complexities of ozone chemistry, and particularly as we got down to these lower levels. And I would submit that, in fact, despite what I think are substantially greater reductions in NO2 and VOCs across the country, we haven't gotten commensurate reductions in ozone. Now, why has that occurred? I think it's because, in part, our understanding or the application of our understanding of ozone chemistry is incomplete. Now, the emphasis, I want to draw that home by sharing data that David Brimmer gave me for the state of Texas. Again, aggregate data in terms of annual emissions of NO2, 1.25 million tons per year. Is that correct, Dave? Now, VOC emissions from source, anthropogenic sources, 1.7 million tons per year. Keep that in mind now, 1.7 tons. Now let me give you another figure, 4.2 million tons per year. That's biogenics. 70% of the VOCs on a statewide basis are biogenics. So when we have modeled all of this, I just offer a word of caution that dollars spent in terms of NO2 may not be dollars that are going to give us the best benefit, irrespective of what our personal assessment is of the health impacts of these very small changes in ozone. And I would emphasize again just those who observe the slides carefully, many times we see sleight of hand maneuvers because that's the way the authors did them originally. 10 PPB reductions. That's not what we're talking about. We better just use plain old common sense notations per PPB reduction. But I just ask us again to go back and fundamentally how we get these potential reductions, if they're there, ends up having big impacts in terms of the cost arena.
Okay, Ann, did you have a comment? So I think Bob had one final real quick question or comment.
Thank you very much. I mean, I think that was the most important talk we've heard at this meeting, and we've heard a lot of very, very important ones. There are hints and even comments now and then about the necessity for punishments for people who dissent from political dogma or governmental actions. Do you think that there's a reality in that? Do you think we will see, in addition to what happened to you?
Guess I can tell you a story. I was fairly controversial at OMB, and some interest groups tried to get me fired once, and the Clinton administration stepped in and said no. They, at least at OMB, we were trying to promote the public interest in Democrat, Republican administrations until I can't speak for what happened after I left, but I will say the morale has not been as good as it was before, and no pun intended, from my colleagues.